Leader.
Today being a Monday, I move that we hold the privilege hour.
Is there any objection? We declare the opening of the privilege hour.
Madam Speaker, first to avail of the privilege hour is Representative Carlos Isagani Zarate of Party List by Luna. I move that we recognize the Honorable Representative.
Representative
Carlos Isagani Zarate.
Representative Carlos Isagani Zarate is hereby recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, my dear colleagues, I rise today to speak on the observance of the 19th United Nations International Day for Indigenous Peoples. On August 9, 1982, the first meeting of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations of the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights was held. To commemorate the said meeting, since 1994, August 9 has been celebrated as the International Day for Indigenous Peoples in recognition of the struggle of the indigenous peoples everywhere in the world. In 2005, the UN also declared the second International Decade of the world's indigenous peoples. Ironically, as the decade of its observance culminates this year, the plight of the country's 14 million indigenous peoples turned from worst to worst. Around 30% of the Philippine total land area is deemed rich with metallic mineral deposits. The 46 trillion peso estimated worth of the Philippine mining industry is fifth in the world, third for gold, fourth for copper, and fifth for nickel. Many of these mineral-rich areas are the mountains and forests which serves as home to indigenous communities where their interests, welfare are constantly threatened by the interests of transnational companies. On the other hand, human rights violations, Madam Speaker, committed against indigenous peoples continue to grow by the number and degree as their ancestral domains are continuously being ravaged in the name of development, like the entry of large-scale mining corporations that are mostly foreign-owned or controlled. A large 60% of mining operations in the Philippines are concentrated in the ancestral domains of the indigenous peoples. Most often, members of the indigenous peoples communities opposing the entry of these large-scale mining corporations are themselves become victims of displacement and other human rights violations like arbitrary detention, persecution, extrajudicial killings, demolition of houses, and others. But poverty is still very much pronounced in the areas populated by our indigenous peoples. For example, according to the 2012 National Statistics Coordination Board data, the Cordillera region, where 99% of the population are indigenous, has some of the highest poverty rates in the Philippines, with the Apayao province as the fourth poorest province in the country and Abra as the ninth. Our region, the Mindanao region, where 61% of the indigenous peoples live, contributes to 31% of the country's overall poverty incidence and has the highest poverty and subsistence incidence among the major island groups. A study by the International Fund for Agricultural Development also shows that these regions with the highest concentrations of indigenous peoples get the smallest allocations from the national government, thus translating to poor provision of basic social services. Another study, Madam Speaker, made by the Austrian Journal for Southeast Asian also revealed that large-scale mining often leads to the loss of their lands and thus poses a serious threat to the livelihood of the indigenous peoples. In truth, Madam Speaker, the Mining Act of 1995, which gives foreign mining corporations the legal basis to remove communities from mining tenements, auxiliary rights to timber and water, and total control of mining projects, limiting the government only to collection of excise tax on mining products, even aggravated the situation of the country's indigenous peoples. The so-called mandatory social provision of the 1995 Mining Act, like the contribution of at least 90% of 1% of each annual direct mining and milling costs for the implementation of sustainable community development programs for the host and neighboring communities, and at least 1% of gross revenue if ancestral land is developed for mining, turned out to be more of a token, as the same did not at all resulted to the improvement of the lives of the indigenous peoples. In stark contrast to the abject lives of the indigenous peoples, mining companies rake in profits by the billions. For example, in 2003, the Atlas Corporation posted a 1.9 billion net income on top of its 14.45 billion revenue from gold and copper sales. And yet, mining contributes less and less to the Philippine economy, at only 0.7% of our gross domestic product in both 2013 and providing only 252,000 jobs in 2013. Meanwhile, the Executive Order Number 79, issued by President Aquino, which supposedly introduced reforms for environmental protection, among others, only further strengthens the privileges of these mining companies. Environmental groups claim that among its detrimental provision is the fact that it allows the national government to override the environmental policies of local government units by allowing destructive exploratory operations based on vague investment projections. Section 12 of EO 79 mandates that the local government units must conform to the regulations, decisions, and policies already promulgated and taken by the national government. Yet, this authority to override local government decisions clashes and impacts on at least 11 mining moratorium policy declared, for example, in the provinces of Capiz, Guimaras, Romblon, Western Samar, Batangas, and South Cotabato. In fact, one of its most deceptive provisions is the so-called moratorium on mining contracts, since prior to its passage, some 71 contracts were already approved, covering over 1,009,000 hectares, or 1/30 of the country's total land area. In fact, the so-called moratorium is only momentary, while the Aquino administration is finalizing a new governing fiscal regime being championed or pushed by the Department of Finance and supported by the Joint Foreign Chambers of the Philippines. Meanwhile, Madam Speaker, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997 is also a failure in terms of protecting the rights of the indigenous peoples. Under the IPRA law, individual or communal rights to ancestral domain can be recognized through the certificates of ancestral domain titles, or CADT. Yet, since 1997, when IPRA was passed, there are more mining contracts that have been granted than the CADTs. There are at least 2,825 mining contracts that have been approved and registered in the years 2010 to 2013 alone, with 1,702 that are still being processed. In contrast, only 37 certificates of ancestral domain titles, or CADTs, are registered, and 156 are still being processed by 2013. In fact, it takes the NCIP an average of 7 years to process a single title. This means, Madam Speaker, that on the other hand, Madam Speaker, IPRA also boasts of providing the mechanism of free, prior, and informed consent, or the FPIC, as a prerogative before mining operations can commence in an area. But in practice, Madam Speaker, this is violated. In fact, there were reports or instances that FPICs were acquired or were obtained through bribery, manipulation, false promises, and it only served to legitimize the forced entry of this mining corporation. A case in point, Madam Speaker, would be the complaint filed by the Council of Elders of the Ginaang tribe in Ginaang, Kalinga Province, wherein the provincial office of the NCIP Kalinga proceeded to facilitate the FPIC process for the mining exploration application of the Makilala Mining Company, despite strong opposition from the Ginaang tribes people. Madam Speaker, it is under this backdrop that our indigenous peoples continue to struggle as we commemorate the culmination of the observance of the United Nations' Second International Decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples. This subject plight of our indigenous peoples, Madam Speaker, necessitates for a review of our existing laws and policies that affected their lives, like the Mining Act of 1995 and the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. As legislators, may we be responsive to their calls and aspirations as we continue to advocate for laws and policies that duly advances their right to self-determination, the protection of the ancestral domain of the indigenous peoples, and the respect for their human rights. Thank you, my dear colleagues. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Majority Floor Leader.
Madam Speaker, I move that we refer the speech of the gentleman from Bayan Muna to the Committee on Rules.
Is there any objection? The chair is on. The motion to refer the privileged speech to the Rules Committee is now approved.